Heyo, I'm Orinum. On Valentine's Day of 2013, Nintendo of America officially announced a brand new evolution for Eevee. It was called Sylveon. At the time, Pokemon fans were not told what type Sylveon is, and so we were left to our imaginations, speculating what type would even make sense for it. Back then, I was a kid who was completely obsessed with Pokemon, and so for months I'd check Cerulean every day as soon as I got home from school, hoping for any crumb of news about the freshly announced Pokemon X and Y, and the brand new evolution. And after Cerulean ran out, I'd watch so many theory videos, and I'd read forums for any leaks and any crunchy screenshots of CoroCoro magazine. What type would Sylveon even be? I thought the best option was the normal type, but that felt too, well, normal for something as important as a new evolution. Other people guessed the flying type because of Sylveon's flowing ribbony design, which I guess could work. There was also speculation of a new type altogether, but no, that can't be it. It's been 13 years since a new type was added. I don't think Game Freak would shake things up like that. Well, fast forward to June of that year, where it was announced in the E3 Nintendo Direct that Sylveon would indeed be a brand new type, the Fairy type. Needless to say, I was pumped. A new type? Oh my god, this is incredible. But here's the thing though. Over the next 13 years, as Fairy type came to feel as natural as grass, fire, water, I wonder if it even makes sense as a type at all. Like, it feels kind of random, right? Aside from the dreadfully needed balance changes it brought, does the Fairy type even make sense to be a thing? And while we're at it, what about the other Pokemon types? This is something I'd been thinking about over the past few years. Even though Pokemon types seem to be completely natural and intuitive to me nowadays, I've slowly realized that they really aren't. At least some of them aren't, anyway. And because of that, there's a lot of Game Freak's design opinions that you can glean just from the types themselves. And you can learn a surprising amount about the world of Pokemon just by looking at what types exist and how they interact with each other. So, let's explore how exactly a creature collecting game uses its type chart and what we can learn from it. And finally, let's try to figure out what exactly is going on with Pokemon's type chart from a design and world building perspective. And also, if you have any thoughts along the way, please let me know in the comments. This video might get a little subjective at times, so it'd be fun to have a conversation about it. Before that though, I hope everyone's doing okay with the summer heat so far. It was pretty bad recently where I am, and it's made it pretty hard to sleep. But luckily, I've been able to catch more Z's with the help of this video's sponsor, Manta Sleep. I'm someone who's pretty sensitive to light, especially when I get headaches. And so for years I'd been using a sleep mask that only sort of got the job done. But recently, I've been using one of Manta's masks, and it's been much nicer. What stood out to me is that the eye cups themselves are fully detachable and adjustable. And combining that with the fact that the mask breathes super well, means I was able to get some great sleep, even when it was hot out. If you'd like to check out Manta Sleep for yourself, click the link in my description or use code ORINM10 to receive 10% off your order. And finally, thank you to Manta Sleep for sponsoring this video. Okay, now, to get started, let me share how I first stumbled into the idea for this theory. And for that, we have to go back in time. A couple years ago, I was out hiking with one of my close friends, and we were talking about creature collecting games in general. Since I've been a Pokemon fan for as long as I can remember, and I like to make my own games for fun, I mentioned how I was tossing around ideas for a creature collector of my own. After talking about it for a while, my friend and I realized that we have some pretty similar tastes in these types of games. So as a source of inspiration, she recommended to me a tiny game called Familiars.io. The next day, I played it for a few hours and was immediately drawn in. The minimalist pixel art style is charming and effective, the gameplay feels like old school Pokemon, and the creatures, called Familiars, their designs immediately evoked a feeling of playing make-believe with toys and plushies. And it's not hard to see why I felt this, especially after looking at the type chart. There's your standard fire, water, leaf trio, the same as Pokemon's. And there's also the Hex type, which still feels familiar to a Pokemon player since it shares traits with Ghost and Dark types. However, the remaining three types felt unique: Plush, Slime, and Robot. And the Plush type in particular stood out to me then, and still does today. In my mind, type systems in RPGs, creature collectors or otherwise, serve two purposes: mechanics and narrative. Mechanically, they serve as a way to add variety, since the player won't be able to steamroll the whole game with a single build or party member. And it's very likely that at some point in the player's journey, they'll encounter an obstacle that's a hard counter to their current playstyle, so they'll have to engage with the game's type system and find another path to victory. This is why type systems exist at a base level, I think. And it's often why we see standard physical types like piercing and slashing, and elemental types such as fire and ice. These are very natural things that exist in our world, so it's intuitive to adapt them into games, and it's also intuitive to engage with them as a player. It also makes sense to use these natural elemental types to create fantastical creatures, and then group them together based on their respective types. Like, it's not hard to imagine a lizard that breathes fire or a fish that shoots water. However, I also feel that these standard types are pretty bland narratively, at least due to how common they are. So when a game introduces a type that's not intuitive, I find it super interesting from a narrative point of view. It serves as a completely diegetic and interactive source of world building, because they emphasize core aspects of a game's world. In Dungeons & Dragons, for example, necrotic is a distinct damage type from acid, because necrotic attacks can wither both the body and the soul, instead of the body alone. In Elden Ring, Holy is a damage type with a distinct visual language and a pretty tactile presence, since it's an extension of the game's main deity, the Greater Will, whose influence can be felt everywhere. In the world of Familiars.io, no one tells you that plushies are significant. The world itself does, implicitly. You encounter 2 at the very beginning of the game, where 2 of the 4 starter familiars that the player can choose from are the plush type. You encounter familiars with buttons and stitches on their bodies. And you encounter plush type moves called patchwork and pins. You discover that the plush type is weak to fire attacks, suggesting that they're inherently flammable and constructed of thread, fabric, and craft materials. As a whole, Familiars.io portrays the feeling that plush types are a category of familiar that is ubiquitous enough to be worth its own unique classification. And the fact that all of this is never told to the player, but rather shown through various familiar designs tied together through a dedicated type, is very special to me. Now let's try to formalize all of this a bit into a central theory that we can work with. In short, you can learn a lot about the design philosophies of a game and the world building that surrounds it simply by looking at the weird types. Now that begs the question, what makes a type weird? Well, like with the plush type in Familiars.io, it's a type that doesn't immediately come to mind when designing a type system in a vacuum. There may be types that aren't tied to things that we often experience in our real world, or maybe they do something novel and unexpected. And so they emphasize something special and unique about the fantastical world they're a part of. But clearly this is pretty wishy-washy. I know it when I see it isn't really that useful by itself. So before we tackle Pokemon's type chart, I think it may be helpful to touch on another game that does a lot of this work for us, by straight up telling us why type mashups are the way they are. Let's talk about Cassette Beasts. For those who haven't tried it out, Cassette Beasts is another creature collector, like Pokemon or Familiars.io. It's also pretty open world, where you're let to explore at your own pace, meeting new characters who travel with you and capturing new monsters by recording them into cassettes. It's a great time, and it should scratch the same itch as Pokemon once you get into it. Part of that is because the type chart itself, again, feels pretty familiar to a Pokemon player, with there being a lot of analogs in their interactions. For example, in Pokemon, grass is weak to flying type attacks, and similarly in Cassette Beasts, the plant type is weak to air type attacks. There's plenty of other analogs too, but there's one type that I want to touch on that I feel is really unique: the plastic type. To me, this is the definitive weird type of Cassette Beasts, because, I haven't seen anything like it in any other creature collectors, and so it perfectly shows what the weird type theory is all about. The very existence of the plastic type, to me, implies that the world of Cassette Beasts is about technology. Not the flashy, virtuous technology that we see in the world of Pokemon, and also not the oppressive, overwhelming technology in a lot of sci-fi settings. It's about technology that doesn't fall into either of those categories. The mundane technology that we see in our day-to-day lives. Things like music in the form of records and cassettes. Things like infrastructure and construction equipment. Things that are everywhere and the bedrock of modern life, but that we just don't think about very much. And I think to a lot of us, plastic is the quintessential mundane technology. But let's check my work here. Let's see if the type chart of cassette beasts can corroborate with me. First, when a lightning type monster is hit with a plastic type move, it gains a debuff called Insulated, which causes spread moves to instead hit one monster. This is how a lot of type interactions work in cassette beasts, by the way. They all cause buffs and debuffs. Anyways, this is a pretty straightforward interaction for the plastic type, I think. It's generally a very good insulator for electricity, so it should debuff monsters like this. In fact, this is a pretty common use for plastic in our day-to-day lives in our world. So the fact that this widespread but understated use of plastic is given this amount of attention says a lot, I think. Next, let's look at how plastic interacts with fire. In real life, burning plastic emits toxic fumes, and so that's why people wear respirators whenever they expect to be working with it. So in cassette beasts, this real-life behavior can be seen in both interactions between fire and plastic. When fire is hit with a plastic attack, it gains the smoke buff, which gives increased evasion. And when plastic is hit with a fire attack, it gains the melted condition, which temporarily turns it into a poison type. I think it's fair to say then that the plastic type in cassette beasts behaves pretty closely to how it does in real life. It fumigates when burned, it can melt easily, and it's pretty toxic in both cases. So again, we can see that the plastic type acts pretty much the same as plastic in real life. My point is, even though cassette beasts does have some fantastical elements, like the astral type for instance, a lot of it is based in our real world more so than a lot of other creature collectors. The creators of cassette beasts clearly care about evoking the same feelings as living in our own world in real life, even in a setting where you can transform into monsters just by listening to music. Okay, that's a lot about not Pokemon. So now that we're warmed up, let's talk about the star of the show. Let's use the weird type theory to figure out some of Pokemon's type charts. Starting with, well, what do we start with? Which of Pokemon's types are actually weird? I'll be honest, some of what I personally view as weird types might actually be pretty intuitive for someone else. And that's totally fair. For this video, the point is not to shame any type in particular. Rather, any types that I do put in the weird category are types that I think deserve some care and analysis, to see what they can say about the world of Pokemon. I think to start, it's pretty safe to say that these types, normal, fire, water, grass, electric, rock, and ice, are not weird. It makes sense to have these in any type system, in my opinion, even if their names are changed, such as changing normal to basic, for example. But a lot of you might be thinking that I'm missing some here. What about types like flying, ground, poison or steel, or maybe bug or ghost? I do agree that all of these might not be weird by the definition of this video, but I don't quite think they're that obvious either. Like, I don't think it makes immediate sense to make a bug its own type, more so than any other kind of animal. So I'm putting these types in a sort of in-between category. So now, for the real meat and potatoes, the truly weird types. The types that I think say a lot about the world of Pokemon. Fighting, Psychic, Dragon, Dark, and Fairy. Honestly, I could probably spend at least an hour dissecting all of these types, one by one. So I think for this video, I'll instead focus on just one that I feel it says the most about the world of Pokemon. The Fairy type. Maybe it's a recency bias, since it's the newest type by about 13 years, but I do feel that it's an odd one to exist at all. It's a distinct type dedicated to a specific archetype of mythical creature, kind of like the Dragon type. But the more I thought about it, the more I grew to appreciate how the Fairy type plays in with the subtle narrative that spans across the many, many Pokemon games. So let's use our theory, and start by looking at the type chart directly. To me, what stands out the most is its dominance over the Dragon type and its weaknesses to poison and steel. We'll come back to the Dragon type later, I promise. So for now, we'll focus on the other two, looking at what they have in common to try to find some thematic identity for the Fairy type in the process. Remember, Pokemon doesn't straight up tell you why some of these interactions exist, like Cassette Beasts does, so we have to read between the lines. Poison types tend to be noxious, grimy, and corrosive. They utilize toxic gases, spores, venoms, and secretions. And they often thrive in, produce, or are made of pollution. all of these traits share the fact that they are acutely harmful to anything that is alive. Something that is vivid, active, lively, becomes dull, sluggish, and decayed when exposed to these toxins. And if something is resistant or immune to the poison type, then it's either 1, adapted to these toxins, or 2, simply less alive. Now, which types are less alive than others? First, there's the obvious ghost type. And if you check for the type chart, it does indeed resist poison, because it's pretty hard to poison something that's not alive. Interestingly, it's not immune to poison, which implies to me that ghosts are at least partially alive, maybe in some sort of limbo state between life and death. But there is one type that's completely immune to poison, the steel type. So I think we can infer that the steel type is maybe the least alive of all the types in the type chart. Or, well, at least partially. With Pokemon like the Magnemite line, the Bronzor line, things like that, I think it's up for debate whether these Pokemon are even alive to begin with. And so with that interpretation, it makes sense that they're immune to poison. Pokemon like Scizor and Steelix though, I think the poison immunity makes more sense as a protective coating. They have parts of their bodies made of artificial, poison-proof metals. Hence, they cannot be poisoned. But I'm getting lost in the nitty-gritty here. We're supposed to be talking about the fairy types. Alright, okay, so since I think it's safe to say that poison types are based on the idea of being toxic to natural living things, and steel types represent some sort of hyper-artificiality, then based off the type chart, fairy types are the exact opposite of that. Sort of like with the grass type, but with an acute sensitivity to artificiality. They are, in a sense, exceptionally natural. Or even further, they're extra alive. Like, literally, they are more alive than any other types. They represent what it means for living things to be supernaturally vivacious. They represent the natural world in its purest form, or they can be even sources of life itself. They are, literally, the essence of life when left undisturbed by the artificiality and harm of the human world. What this tells me about the world of Pokemon, then, is that it has an ever-present dichotomy of natural versus artificial. There's a constant theme of urbanization and pollution and technology overtaking the untouched, unknown parts of the natural world. And again, all of this can be gleaned just from the type chart. Pokemon's type chart shows us that the world of these games is made up of contrast, natural and artificial, harmful and healing, life and death. Now, let's dig deeper. Let's get weirder. Let's push the weird type theory to its limits and talk about one of the weirdest type interactions that I think Game Freak has ever come up with. Namely, what the heck is going on with dragons and fairies? I'm willing to bet that most people would say that this type interaction makes no sense. Dragons weak to fairies? What were they thinking? Well, call me crazy, but I think we can genuinely find an answer if we dig deep enough into the type chart. Okay, to start, let's take a look at dragon types. They resist fire, water, grass, and electric, and they're weak to ice, dragon, and fairy. This feels really arbitrary at first, I think, so let's take it in chunks. First, the resistances. What do fire, water, grass, and electric all have in common? To me, these all feel like natural elements. They all feel like essential building blocks for the natural, living world. Not literally the building blocks like earth and air, but they're the amorphous sources that provide movement and energy to all living things. Water is a home and source to a lot of life. Grass is a simple, common form of life, and it's a food source for many living things. Fire and electricity are both energy in its purest form. So if we consider why dragon may resist all of these types, these primitive forms of energy and life, I think it makes sense to view dragons as the masters of them. Dragons have an innate expertise over the primordial, and so they have, in a sense, become the masters of the natural world. Not separate from it though, and not supernatural either. There's a reason they don't dominate over fire, water, grass, and electric with super effective damage. And so to further emphasize this, I think this is where the weakness to the ice type comes in. The ice type is pretty much a stand-in for the cold, or rather, a lack of heat, a lack of energy, and maybe even a lack of life. So with a type that flourishes in the primal elements for life, it makes sense that ice, a lack of those elements, is a weakness. So, okay, the dragon type represents life in the natural world pushed to its limits, having achieved mastery over its environment. Isn't that what I was saying the fairy type was only a few minutes ago? Good question. The difference here is a little subtle, but I promise you it is there. Stick with me here. Essentially, dragon types are on the same level as fire, water, grass, electric, heck, even the normal type. They are an ordinary part of the natural world. Their trait is simply that they have immense potential to utilize the elements around them. This is shown through the dragon type's complete lack of positive matchups when attacking, similar to the normal type in how it doesn't do any super effective damage. The fairy type, on the other hand, is supernatural. Its life essence taken to an extreme and pushed almost to a higher plane of being. The trade-off, then, is that it's extra sensitive to artificiality, which comes in the form of poison and steel types. So, dragon types are weak to fairy types because dragons are very well adapted for the entire gamut of ordinary parts of the natural world. They are masters over the ordinary and the expected. But when it comes to the extraordinary, the supernatural, the untouched parts of the natural world, dragons are not prepared at all. And so what we can gather about the world of Pokémon as a whole is that there's yet another thematic dichotomy going on here. The ordinary versus the supernatural, embodied by dragons versus fairies. Now remember where we started. We haven't looked at any outside sources here. We haven't even looked at the games themselves, just the type charts. And from the type chart alone, we've been able to gather that there's a thematic push and pull between natural versus artificial, healing versus harm, the living versus the dead, and now the ordinary versus the supernatural. And I feel like we've only scratched the surface here. But this is already my longest video yet, so I should wrap it up here. But see what I mean though? If I tried to tackle all of the weird types, we'd be here all day. But that's sort of the beauty of this theory, I think. You can always find some meaning and intentionality in a game no matter where you look. Every tiny decision, every little number was decided by someone and added to the game, and then further decided to be kept in the game by dozens, if not hundreds of others. Even if it's a tiny thing, it can say a lot about the people who decided it, and it can mean a lot to the world that's being crafted by these developers. When you look at the plush type in Familiars.io, or the plastic type in Cassette Beasts, or the fairy type in Pokémon, you can tell that the game was made by a group of people, all with their own beliefs and their own lives with their own experiences that are reflected in the games they've created. A type system by itself is a pretty unassuming, technical part of a creature collector, sure. But the fact it's so central to the identity of these games means it's always worth taking a deeper look. Because what you can find can shine a light on the hundreds of hours of work that's gone into creating them. And it can uplift your own love for these games to a whole new, maybe even supernatural level. But what do you think about this theory? Do you think it can be used like this for any other games? Or maybe you feel that my thoughts about the fairy type were a little off the mark, which is totally fair. Either way, I'd love to read your thoughts in the comments. Also, if you enjoyed the video, it would mean a ton if you considered liking and subscribing to let me know. As always, huge shout out to my patrons over on Patreon, who actually helped decide the topic of this video and the spring topic poll. And speaking of, since it's the summer topic poll is up. And so if you want to vote on a topic for one of my next videos, now is a good time to sign up. But anyways, thank you to anyone who watched, and especially anyone who made it to the end and who's listening to this right now. And so I hope to see you in the next one.